We are delighted to welcome back Dr. Edwin Gordon, who delves into a variety of history topics for us this season. Today's topic is the Monument Men and their mission, recovering Europe's art treasures from the Nazis. Dr. Gordon is an internationally known historian, speaker, researcher, and author. He taught history at DePaul University, Chicago, and he has presented historical programs across America to community groups and trade associations and colleges, universities, foundations, and museums. He is the author of 18 books, and we have some of them in the library, and over 300 articles in the areas of history, business, and education. He has appeared on CBS Network's The Early Show, CNN, the PBS NewsHour, National Public Radio, and many other media venues. Dr. Gordon earned his BA and MA degrees in history at DePaul University, Chicago, and his PhD at Loyola University, Chicago. With that, please give Dr. Gordon a nice warm welcome to the Rancho Mirage Library.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's wonderful to be here in the only part of the country that doesn't have any snow. In 1920s Vienna, this lady, Maria Altmann, was a little girl, and she would visit her uncle Ferdinand. She always admired her aunt's golden Adele. This was a portrait by Gustav Klimt. It hung in her aunt's bedroom with 3 other landscape paintings. And in 1938, the Nazis, who had taken over Austria and annexed it to Germany, stole all 4 of these paintings. Maria fled to the United States, to California, with her husband Fritz. Later, she heard that the Golden Adele had ended up in the Austrian National Gallery in Vienna. In 1997, she began her long battle to have this painting returned to her and to her family. This is the story of the greatest looting of treasure in modern history by a criminal regime, and the story of how much of it has been recovered and is still being recovered to this day. This battle goes on, and today we will learn more about it. So here is our agenda. We'll talk about pre-war, the great art theft itself, and finally, the post-war experiences of many people, including possibly even people in this room with material that was stolen from their families during the Second World War. Adolf Hitler, the supreme leader of Germany, and his Nazi ideology of hate. A paranoid schizophrenic, a political genius, but it resulted in widespread disaster. Certainly the book burning, the arresting of intellectuals, Jews, labor leaders, Catholics, Protestant ministers, anyone who stood in his way. 11 million people, including 6 million Jews, would be murdered by this regime. And the confiscation of so-called degenerate art was part of his program. Hitler was an anti-modernist plus. I don't think he would be here for Modernist Week. The sale of this modernist art helped to finance Hitler's economic miracle and the German rearmament that led to World War II. Here are some of his brown shirts seizing what he called degenerate art. On March 18th, 1937, the Germans had a day of German art in Munich. This is part of their parade with their fake knights, as you can see, riding these horses. Also, it was the opening of a new temple of art, of ideas, racist and nonsensical art of what he called the classic German Nordic art. And here is Hitler leading other officials through that museum. Well, what did this look like? Well, here's a good sample of great art. Hitler's portrait, the idealized German peasant families, heroic war scenes. Hitler ended up actually buying most of this art for the government since no one else wanted it. Nearby, another program. And this was a program on degenerate art itself, an exhibition by 113 artists drawn, and it drew vast crowds. In fact, by November 30th of that year, 2 million people had gone through the art museum to look at this art. There were hundreds of modern art and contemporary art works by people like Monet, Cézanne, Pissarro, and others. The Nazis angrily shut this down because their own exhibit flopped, and this one drew these vast crowds. So they closed it down, saying that the Germans' people had a poor taste in art. Well, now enters one of our principal characters of this drama, Hildebrand Gurlitt. His son recently was in the news because he inherited a vast collection of art that this man helped to steal for Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. So after the exhibition, Gurlitt was one of several well-known art dealers who was then appointed to market these paintings in Switzerland, Holland, France, and elsewhere, and sell them to private individuals and art galleries. Another 1,000 paintings and 3,800 drawings were burned by the Nazis that they didn't sell from this art exhibit. But this is the beginning of the pollution and how galleries such as in Chicago, the Art Institute, here in the West Coast, major art museums have actually found in their collections art that was originally stolen by the Nazis and then sold through people like him into that art network, so that it became very convoluted and no one really knew exactly where it had come from. On September 1st, 1939, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany marched into Poland. The war began. Here's the German army who's stepping in their victory parade in Warsaw that year. Then they marched across much of Europe and into the USSR, so that by June of 1941 or December of 1941, almost all of Europe was under the control of the Nazis. The ultimate Nazi confiscation of art and other treasures is unprecedented in modern history. The part that is truly amazing is not only did they steal it, it was a government-sanctioned program at every single level of the Nazi administration. 25% of the resources of Nazi Germany that were used to fight World War II were confiscated from countries across Europe. We're not just talking about art now. We're talking about food, industrial capacity, and in the end, slave labor. The whole French army, when it surrendered in June of 1940, never made it back to their homeland. Instead, they ended up as slave labor in the Nazi factories for the duration of World War II. Once the war started, of course, many European museums, fearing that they might lose, began to move their art. So the French, the English, and the Dutch, and the Italians took precautions to remove art and store it in safe places. Well, here is a famous Wing Victory. How many of you have seen Wing Victory at the Louvre? Well, here it is being moved to a safe location. Or what about the Mona Lisa? The same. Much of this art was then stored and hidden from the Nazis for the duration and was never found, even though the Nazis searched, tortured, extorted, and tried to find where this art was. When the German army occupied Paris in 1940, they established a so-called Art Monument Protection Office. What did that mean? Well, they began to centralize all of the art from the art collection in both the Louvre and the Jeu de Paume. And here you can see is von Rundstedt, the German officer standing in front. Now, von Rundstedt was a field marshal in the German army and had been one of the principal generals that had brought about the defeat of France in 3 weeks. Think about that. In World War I, for 4 years, the Germans tried to take Paris. The Nazis did it basically in 3 weeks. Truly a stunning victory. I've talked about this, maybe some of you have heard it, at the Palm Springs Air Museum, because it was a month that really shook the world. But von Rundstedt had a history. He was a young man in World War I, an officer, and he was in Belgium when the Germans advanced through Belgium. And when they advanced, they looted, they pillaged, they raped, they murdered. And he was ashamed. He came from a very conservative Prussian aristocratic background. And he swore that if this ever happened again in another war, and he was in a position of authority, he would stop it. So when the Germans marched into France, he did. They centralized it at the Louvre, all this art. They centralized it at the Jeu de Paume. And then they surrounded it with troops. And they said, no one's going to get anything. They also went to the chateaus of the Louvre, of the Loire, and surrounded those. They even went into Burgundy and Bordeaux and surrounded those facilities so that nothing would be pillaged. Well, now, up until this time, until 1940, here's the man that had been the #1 thief of Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte. He was the record holder. Now, how many of you have been to Venice and admired those horses above St. Mark's Cathedral? Beautiful, aren't they? Of course, the Venetians stole them from Constantinople. And when Napoleon marched in to Venice and ended the Republic, he then confiscated those statues and brought them to Paris. They were later returned. Well, now, the Nazis were not going to allow the army to protect. So here are the boys, Hitler, Göring, Goebbels, Hess. They decided to get around the German army's protection program. So Hitler passed a series of laws. He would protect so-called abandoned art. So he would save it. He created an organization called the ERR, which basically was the Nazi confiscation organization. And their job was to save art, and it would be divided into 4 categories. The first, to protect it, would be, of course, the Führer himself. He was an artist, you know that. Second would be Hermann Göring, who became interested in art. Third would be other Nazi leaders, like Himmler, the head of the SS. Fourth would be the German museums. And by the way, they did add a 5th category, the French museums at the very bottom of the list. So what they could not confiscate, Hitler and Göring then bought. Now what the Germans did in occupied Europe is they issued a new currency of marks, which they printed in huge volumes. So when the Germans were in Paris, they could buy, on leave, they could buy nice shoes for their wives or sweethearts using these occupation marks. And of course, inflation went wild because of this. Now Hitler, of course, always wanted to be an artist. After World War I, he failed to get into the Vienna Art Academy. Twice he tried. And instead he went into politics. Too bad for the world. Well, now, here is an actual Hitler watercolor. He painted, and there are actually 2,000 works painted by Hitler that we know of between 1905 and 1920. This is a picture of the Civil Registry Office in Old Town Munich, Old Town Hall of Munich. It's not a great painting, it's not bad, but it's certainly pretty sterile. It is sold for $161,000 to someone in the Middle East, which we won't talk about. Now, before World War II began, Hitler started to collect art. Here's a picture of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, presenting Hitler with his birthday present. Hitler was 50 in 1939. There was a huge parade in Berlin and then a birthday party with people giving him presents. Well, here is Himmler giving Hitler a stolen painting. Actually, it was a painting of Frederick the Great, one of Hitler's big heroes. So Hitler now began to amass a huge collection of art. Herman Gurlitt and other German art dealers, of course, roamed Europe buying, confiscating, and stealing art. And Hitler intended to build a museum to house this collection. This would be built in Lintz, Austria. He was born in a village near Lintz. And this museum would be larger than the Louvre, larger than the Hermitage. How many of you have been to the Hermitage? Huge museum, bigger than the Hermitage. In fact, here is a rare photo of Hitler with his architects designing the Lintz Museum. This is the Lintz Museum. Take a look at this. This collection would continue to be augmented and confiscated by enemy alien property wherever the Nazis could steal it. Hitler's art collection grew in 1933, 0. In 1945, 8,000 paintings, plus drawings, sculpture, and other items. After the war, Hitler also planned to build a new capital city in Berlin, a huge, enormous property. The Great Arc de Triomphe would be 10 times larger than the one in Paris. There it is. You can see the Arc de Triomphe. And behind it, well, here's Hitler and Speer and another architect working on the design. The Third Reich Congress building would also have a dome, 4 times the size of St. Peter's. Think about that. Now, there's an interesting story because his architect, Speer, maybe some of you have read some of Speer's books, because Speer was not executed with the other Nazis. He survived the war, though he served time in prison. He tested whether or not it could stand the weight, because Berlin in German means swamp. Like St. Petersburg, it was built on very sandy, swampy soil. So they tested the weight loads, and guess what they found? If they had built this, it gradually would have sunk into the ground. If you go to Berlin, you can go to the test sites. They still are there with these huge pylons gradually sinking into the ground. You can see it. After Hitler's museum, of course, there was the Göring collection. Hermann Göring was Hitler's heir apparent, the head of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. Now, Herman, Smiling Herman, was never unpleasant in his dealings with the art world. He would arrive in high spirits on a palatial train, complete with an oversized bathtub and great decorated uniforms, one to go for almost every day of the week. On state occasions, Göring would restrain himself. He, however, wore so many medals that the Germans would joke privately that the decorations read on the edge continued on the back. Göring arrived at the Jeu de Paume in November of 1940, and it was done up like a major opening. Flowers adorned, beautiful rugs, galleries crammed with furniture and decorative art. The selection was presented to him was staggering. It included everything in storage. On November 5th, he again came and spent a day there, picking one picture after another. He would choose from mostly Dutch and French masters the collections of the Rothschilds and the Windensteins, among them Rembrandt's Boy with a Red Beret and a magnificent Van Dyck portrait of a lady. After his second visit, the confiscations continued. Truckload after truckload would appear at the door of the Jeu de Paume and be dumped there, often without any indication of its provenance. But there was also clocks, statues, paintings, jewelry, furniture, books, from so-called abandoned apartments. The Nazis hunted for the Rothschild masterpieces with particular diligence. They then quickly pronounced them abandoned. The Germans confiscated 5,000 works from the Rothschild holdings alone, including paintings by Vermeer, Raphael, Rembrandt, Rubens, Titian, Goya, Van Dyck, all the great masters. This leads us to the fascinating story of the forger's spell. This is the story about Hans van Merrigan, a great, famous art Dutch forger. The Nazi greed was tremendous, and van Merrigan, before the war, had developed tremendous skills as a forger. Here is a Vermeer painting that he had persuaded an expert in the Netherlands was a real Vermeer. Vermeer painted very few paintings, but this one was discovered. Unfortunately, it was not a Vermeer, it was a Van Mergen. And he persuaded Göring to buy it. And he persuaded the Nazis to buy many other forged paintings that he prepared for them. Now, after the war, in fact, for this painting, Göring traded 137 other paintings to buy this painting. It recently sold for $23,000. After the war, because this artist, this forger, had become so infamous as a forger, but also as a collaborator with the Nazis, they tried him as a collaborator in court because they intended to execute him. Art experts came and looked at this so-called Vermeer, and they said, "What do you mean? This is a fake." Suddenly, he became a national hero in the Netherlands for having duped the Nazis, having spent millions of dollars on garbage. Now today, for those of you that get the Financial Times, you maybe notice an interesting article, because in London, at the Dulwich Picture Gallery in South London, they are going to have one of their masterpieces reproduced as a fake. In fact, there's an entire industry now in China, the so-called museum quality industry of oil painting by an oil painting manufacturing company. For only a price of $120, you can get a museum quality painting. So what they are going to do is take a painting from their collection in London, put the fake up on the wall and see if people can find it. Then they're going to put the fake and the real one side by side. And the reason they're doing this is because of the lack of interest by so many people today in the masters and the history of art, which I find very sad. I am a professional historian, but I also have found it is very important to also have an understanding of art, how it was developed, because it's part of the story of civilization, and it's part of the soul of every culture. That's one reason why I think this story about the Nazis is so important. But the whole idea of faking art like this is, to me, a very detestable thing. The Chinese have faked everything else, and now they're going to fake the Louvre, I guess. Well, Göring, where did Göring's art go? Well, he styled himself as somewhat of a sportsman. So Göring first built a small hunting lodge. This is his small hunting lodge, Karen Hall. He had 8 houses. This was his favorite. Of course, it was built with millions of dollars of state funds. There he housed his quote-unquote protected art collection. Karen Hall was 2 hours from Berlin. He also had a sprawling park, and it was stocked with bison. I'm sorry, we lost the slide for some reason. Well, the slide was a picture of his wife with bison, and in this case, with her pet lions. Upstairs was Göring's model railroad. No, this is not the railroad at the Living Desert, no. It was laid out with hundreds of feet of track and toy airplanes on wire that could drop real bombs dropping on the trains. In 1945, as the Russian army approached Berlin, Göring blew up Karen Hall. Between April of 1941 and July of 1944, over 4,000 cases filling 138 boxcars containing at least 22,000 tons of rare art was shipped to Nazi Germany. Hitler himself chose this fake pseudo-medieval castle of Neuschwanstein, built by the mad King Ludwig of Bavaria in remote Austria, to house part of this collection. But so vast was this collection that it ended up being shipped to remote locations, including salt mines and other mines across all of Europe, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. Now, in June 6th, 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy, and the Nazis continued to ship their thievery until August the 8th, as the Nazis closed in on Paris. By that point, they had raided about 72,000 houses and had shipped off over 1 million cubic meters of stolen goods on 30,000 rail cars. This also included such things as you see here, the bars of gold that were part of the National Bank of the Netherlands. The Germans also decided to move the art that was stashed at the Jeu de Paume. Now, here is Paul Scofield in a famous movie, The Train. How many of you have ever seen the movie The Train? All right. Well, here he plays a German officer who actually is an art expert, and now he has been ordered to crate up all that art and ship it off for, quote, protection to Germany. In the movie, Rose Valland, who was the curator of the Jeu de Paume, had a secret record of all the Louvre's art treasures hidden from the Nazis. She wrote about how the museum's walls were stripped bare, and the Germans then packed up France's greatest art treasures to be shipped to Germany. Now, a special train was then commandeered to transport this priceless treasure to the Reich. Well, where was the train? Well, Hollywood, of course, in the movie that also stars Burt Lancaster as a railroad manager and also a member of the underground, they have tricked the Germans so that the train keeps going around in circles, and instead of leaving France and going to Germany, stays in France. Well, what really happened is less dramatic, but in some ways even more spine-tingling. Because you see, this art treasure never left Paris. The reason? The locomotive that the Germans were going to use, the engine, was commandeered to move troops or goods that they thought were more valuable than art. So instead, these boxcars, 15 of them loaded with this art, was shunted off in a siding in suburban Paris, and for 2 weeks sat there, unguarded, unknown, unprotected. Luckily, no one discovered it and pilfered it until the Allies found its location and saved the art. Now, as the war was coming to an end in 1944, the Allies appointed a Monument Commission of Art to track down and return Nazi confiscated property. You've seen the movie The Monument Men. The men in that movie were drawn from the ranks, as you see here, of major museums. Cambridge University for Balfour. Hancock was a renowned sculptor. Jardin was with the French National Museum. Posey had a degree in architecture. Romner was the curator of the Metropolitan Museum. Stout was an art conservator, and many others. These men worked solo. They had teams of technicians, translators, and guards, but they didn't work like the Rat Pack, as you saw in the movie, where there were 3, 4, 5, 6 of them working together in a mine, or etc. There were too few of them, and they spread out all over, not just France and Germany, but also Italy. We'll talk about Italy in a minute. The first step involving the loot was enormous recoveries like Göring's and Hitler's, and countless smaller 109 depositories ultimately were discovered, and collecting it and putting it in temporary depositories. By the way, in the movie, it was shown how the woman at the Jeu de Paume, Valande, didn't trust America and thought that we were going to steal it. That is a fabrication. She trusted us, she cooperated fully with us from the beginning. It makes the movie more interesting doing it the way they did. Perhaps never before reported a stunned visitor to one such improvised warehouse had such a collection of wealth been under one roof. The haul included billions of dollars in gold bullion, mostly from the Hungarian silver reserves, entire rooms piled to the ceiling with canvas bags, and hogsheads of precious stones, watches, gold jewelry of every kind, and unfortunately wedding rings, and true enough, the gold fillings of concentration camp victims. As the Nazis gathered their art and their records, they brought in they were slowly uncovered by the monument men. They began to comprehend the staggering magnitude of this Nazi operation, and they were less and less sympathetic with all of those who had collaborated with the Nazis. The Third Reich's wartime version of looting was different from any other in previous history because it was officially planned and expertly carried out by every division and part of the German armed forces, including the army. Patton's Third Army, racing across Germany, found in Merkers a mine shaft. And they went into Merkers, and what did they discover? Well, they found part of Germany's gold reserve. At first, a few soldiers were caught with helmets full of gold coins. Patton immediately sent an entire tank battalion and 700 men and sealed off the museum. Here's a picture of Eisenhower looking and inspecting the treasures of the museum itself. They went down into the museum in a mine shaft elevator with one cable. Patton, Bradley, Eisenhower. Bradley said, you know, if that cable broke, we'd have a lot of openings in the higher command. Eisenhower told him to shut up. Back at the Castle Neuschwanstein, intact, well-guarded, 1,300 paintings, boxes containing the Rothschild jewels, and meticulous records of the ERR with over 20,000 catalog cards. I know we don't use those anymore in libraries. My wife's a librarian. It's all online, guys. But they had 20,000 catalog cards detailing this. On May 8th, 1945, Patton's Third Army reached the Alt-Aus mine. This was the mother lode. In a room locked, measuring 200 by 30 feet, bricked up walls, concrete floors, 600 high-quality paintings of the Rhineland museums. The original manuscript of Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. The great oaken doors of Santa Maria and Capitol in Cologne, and much, much more. In another room were 6 cases containing the gold and silver shrines with the relics of Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, the robe of the Virgin, and the rest of the cathedral's treasures. George Stout, one of the most renowned of the monument men, compiled a list of how much art the Nazis had stashed in just this one place. 6,500 paintings, 2,300 drawings, watercolors, 954 prints, 137 pieces of sculpture, and on it went. On another site, they discovered 5,000 church bells in a yard, sitting. Here in 1945, in another mine, is a Rembrandt Self-Portrait found by Dale Ford and Henry Ettlinger. Here is a picture of Harry in 2010 at the Karlsruhe Museum with the restored Rembrandt painting. Because of his Jewish heritage, his family was never allowed to see that painting when they lived there, but now he could see it close up. This is a picture of the international team of monument men and women, all right, at a Munich collecting point. Let's not leave out the women, that's right. No, what happened to the slide? Who did that to me now? In Italy, another art restoration was also developed. There were teams, again, from the United States Army personnel, but I have news for you. In the Army, they did not call them, the other officials, officers, did not call them the monument men. They called them the Venus Fixers. Why? Because it was their job to find the Venus de Milos and others, restore them, fix them, and return them. So the real term was Venus Fixers. I guess it didn't have the ring for the book or the movie. In Italy, where this group worked, and there's a whole book entitled The Venus Fixers. I have a list of bibliography for those of you interested of books on this topic. It was to protect, the Italians were concerned about protecting this art from Allied bombing. And also, as the Germans, once Italy surrendered in 1943, they wanted to prevent the Germans from stealing Italian art and protecting it in Germany. In fact, some of that art we talked about before in those mines was from Italy. In Florence, here's one of the storage sites at a village right near Florence. And here are some of the notable members of the Venus Fixers who worked in Italy. And they, too, should deserve recognition for what they achieved. Think of this. If they hadn't done this, you wouldn't have seen Botticelli when you were in Florence. They saved this painting. Now, another interesting episode that should also be revealed of this great theft was also the theft of wine. And there's a very interesting book called Wine and War. Well, the Germans, once they moved into France, appointed 3 wine Führers. Now, who were these men? They were the men that were the principal representatives of the importing industry from France into Germany. They were Germans. For Bordeaux, one for Burgundy, and one for Champagne. Now, the 2 Führers for Bordeaux and Burgundy said to the French, look, this war is going to end, and once the war is over, we're going to go back to trading like we always did. So let's play it cool. So what did they do? Well, they would take a nice bottle of Lafite Rothschild, and they put in maybe the 5th growth. Or they put in other inferior wine. And then they mix a few good bottles as well. So that the stocks of good wine were not completely destroyed. Unfortunately, that worked in Bordeaux and Burgundy, but the wine Führer for Champagne would not play ball, and the Nazis stole the wine of Champagne. Luckily for us, you don't store champagne for 20 or 30 years. It's drunk pretty rapidly, so that industry recovered. But then there's the famous story of Le Tour d'Argent. How many of you have eaten at the Tower of Silver in Paris? Anybody? Okay, a few. That is probably one of the most famous gourmet restaurants in all the world, with one of the greatest wine cellars in the world. And they took precautions. They knew the Nazis would come. So they took all the good wine to another location in Paris, another basement, put it in the cellar, then used old brick and bricked up the wall. Sure enough, the Germans marched into Paris in June. One of the first places they went to, the Tower of Silver. They said, show us your wine. They went downstairs, they looked at the wine, they said, well, what happened to all this great wine? They said, well, you know, there was a depression, we had to sell some of this off, the stocks have been low, the war, this is the best that we have. But they did survive the war. So now, meanwhile, And there's, of course, the Loire, Bordeaux, Burgundy, Champagne. Sorry, I should have shown you that before. Well, now there's Hitler. Now we have Hitler in 1945. First we have the fantasy. Here he is in the bunker. The Russians are closing in on Berlin. They're not that far away. He's still looking at his museum in Lintz. Later on, once the war was over, here's the reality. There's the bunker. That's in the ruins after he's killed himself. The Russians took over. There's a painting in the bunker. I don't know what it is. Maybe one of you can identify it for me. But that was the reality of what happened in the end to Hitler's dreams of glory of art. Well, now the immediate problem, of course, is just that, who owns all this art? And they had, the first task was to go and try to find out where all this art belonged. And first, of course, they saved it because some of it was getting moldy in these mines and locations, and they had to store it. But where do you store all this art treasure? You couldn't, even if you knew the museum, many of the museums had been bombed or were in bad condition, and they couldn't return them to the museums initially. And also, of course, just to give you another idea of the size, there's all the gold theft. And you also notice the uncounted, 1.96 billion, yes. So all this, there's part of Göring's art collection, which also includes all this furniture, candles, candelabra, everything else. And this gives you an idea of the magnitude of what was stolen. So they decided to choose some of the best paintings, and they would ship them, temporarily at least, to the National Gallery in Washington. And they started a schedule. This was in 1948. It opened. There were 202 paintings. Several million people went through the National Gallery during that tour. And these paintings then went to New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Boston, Detroit, Cleveland, Minneapolis, San Francisco, Los Angeles, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, and Toledo, before finally being returned in 1955. All of them are returned to the various museums, including those in the American sector in Berlin. Now, to this day, of course, there is tremendous amount of art that is being in dispute. Here in California, the Getty Museum a few years ago returned a piece of stolen Nazi art that they did not realize had been stolen because they had bought it through a dealer who had earlier bought it through another individual from the Nazis. Cornelis Gurlitt, the son of Hildebrand, was discovered in 2013 to have 1,500 paintings in his apartment. And here is a sample of those paintings. There, well, here's Gurlitt. Let's go back to Gurlitt, sorry. Here's the paintings. Matisse and many others. In fact, the most important one was Woman with a Fan by Matisse, valued at $20 million. Gurlitt died in 2014. Initially, of course, he had stonewalled the whole thing, but that wasn't going to work. So he left it all to a German museum. That museum, there are still many paintings in dispute, and that museum has agreed to work with the German government and other governments to return anything that is identified that was stolen from the Nazis. In March of 2014, the French government returned 3 paintings stolen by the Nazis to their rightful owners. But hundreds more of stolen paintings still hang in French museums. Now, I was just in Berlin not that long ago, and I was looking at their fine art museum, and I was wondering how many of these paintings were stolen from some other source. Could have been from Russia, because the Germans stole a tremendous amount of art when they invaded Russia. And of course, when the Russians occupied Germany, they stole a lot of that art and took it back to Russia as well. So now they exchange. Once in a while, they'll exchange art. Now, in 1999, Maria Altmann, who we talked about at the beginning of this program, tried to sue the Austrian government and recover the Golden Adele and other family paintings. The case ended up in the United States Supreme Court, and in 2004, it went to arbitration. She won. In 2006, the Golden Adele arrived in the United States with other paintings, and this painting now hangs in the new gallery in Manhattan, New York, since Maria's aunt always wanted her portrait to spend its days on view for the public. Now, in this year, a movie, The Woman in Gold, which will star Helen Mirren, will shortly be out talking about this story. But there are many other stories that are yet to be written. An estimated 20% of the art currently on the European art market was taken from someone during World War II and is yet to be returned. And so the rescue of Europe's stolen art treasures continues to this very day. Now, there have been many interesting books written about this topic. One is The Monument Men by Etzel, The Rape of Europa by Nicholas, The Venus Fixtures by Bray, and then The Forger's Spell by Dolnik. And I have a little bibliography. I have a few copies up here for those of you interested. And maybe some of these books, if they're not here in this library, they are readily available. And I encourage you, if you're interested, to read about this. Now we have time, I think, for questions. And we have a microphone. We can turn the lights up. Thank you very much. Thank you.